Many of the people attending the programs have been Dallas citizens eager to hear for the first time accounts of fellow Dallasites who were here and are still here, determined to make this city a better place to live, work, and learn for everyone. And tonight we're truly delighted to present a panel that includes award-winning journalists and lifelong community leaders, people who strive to level the playing field for Dallas Hispanics. And it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator of tonight's panel, Yolette Garcia, who has a really hectic schedule. We're very grateful because tomorrow she's going off to San Antonio.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Currently Director of Multimedia Communications at KERA, Yolette has served as Assistant Radio Station Manager, Radio News Director, Executive Producer for Television Programming, Producer, and Researcher. Her projects are, as Executive Producer at KRA include the Emmy Award-winning documentary After Goodbye. Among her many awards are the Buck Marriott Award from the Press Club of Dallas for Career Achievement in Journalism. She is summa cum laude graduate of Southern Methodist University and the niece of the late Dr. Hector P. Garcia, the founder of the American GIA Forum. Please now let me welcome our tonight's panel.
It's my pleasure to be here. When you do good journalism, you know who are the real pillars of their communities. And there is no doubt that Rene Martinez and Catalina Valdez Scott are such. These two remarkable people make our city vital, strong, and they also have the context of the history that we should never, ever forget. And so I'm delighted to be with them this evening because they can tell you much better than I, because they're from Little Mexico, what it was like to be there. The formal introduction for Rene Martinez is that he is the Executive Director of DISD's Mentoring and Dropout Prevention Program, forgive me. In 1971, he was appointed to the Tri-Ethnic Committee, and we'll talk a little bit about that tonight, established by Federal Judge Mac Taylor to devise a desegregation plan for the schools. Catalina Valdez Scott has been a community volunteer for most of her life. I think most people know her as the president of Federaciones de Organizaciones Mexicanas, Federation of Mexican Organizations, which pioneered the celebrations of Cinco de Mayo and 16 de Septiembre. Her many years of service have earned her a lot of recognition from mayors, from the National Parks Department and the Mexican Tourism Department, as well as other organizations. So I'd like you to welcome both of these extraordinary people, Rene Martinez and Catalina Valdez Scott. I want to give thanks to the Sixth Floor Museum for running our KERA's, I say our as if everyone would know what that is, KERA's documentary on Little Mexico. It was a labor of love to do that documentary that featured both of our guests this evening. And the documentary shows a lot of fond memories and a solid sense of community. But Little Mexico also was a place that experienced a lot of social change. And that's what we're going to get into this evening. And then I'd also like to project forward to today, especially with what's happening to our very increasing and very large Latino population, because these two people can tell you a lot about that as well. So it's important to push the discussion a little bit to the future. And I'd like to start with Catalina because she very kindly, as someone who loves history, wanted to talk about what it was like to live there and how the neighborhood came into being. So Catalina, I'll hand it over to you so you can give your remarks.
Thank you. I feel very honored to have been asked to participate in this discussion. Growing up, being born in Dallas, in 1 block away from Little Mexico. I was just on the other side, but they considered us part of Little Mexico. The street where I was born isn't even there anymore. It's part of Woodall Rogers. when the in the 20s, when the Mexican people started coming to Dallas and to the United States after the Mexican Revolution, they looked for a place where they could have something in common, and also for the purpose of the language, they had to find, and so they started settling in what is now Little Mexico. At the time, it was a Jewish settlement. When Mexican people started moving in, the Jewish people started moving out. They went to South Dallas. They wanted to be close to people who understood their ways, their religion, their way of life, their culture, and also, like I said, on account of the language. So most of us spoke Spanish at home since we were born. And then we went to kindergarten, where we learned a little bit of English. Then we went to, I went to Cumberland, where we had to speak English. There was no bilingual program at that time. So, I mean, we either sink or swim, swim or sink. So that, a lot of our friends, would attended Crozier Tech after that. Some of the people that I went to school with, some of my schoolmates, did not graduate because some of the families were very poor, and they had to take them out of the classes in the middle of the school year to take them to the beet field, the onion fields, and, like that. So the following year, they would have to start all over again. So by the time I graduated when I was 13, and I had some who graduated in my class that were 17 years old. And by that time, a lot of them were graduating from high school, so they didn't have much of a chance. Back there, then, everybody knew everybody else, and so, there was no air conditioning, so at night, and even during the day, you could keep the windows open. There was nothing, it was safe. Let's see. And little by little, the people started buying their homes there. There were, it was small neighborhood grocery stores, beauty shop, barber shop. One of them was owned by a compadre of mine. And in addition to the Guadalupe church, there was a Protestant church. And also, at one time, for several years, maybe 10, 15 years, there was a Mexican Catholic church. And it was not recognized by the Roman Catholic Church, and they called the priest there the rebel priest. And but he had a lot of following. I don't know what happened to it finally. The people kept moving from place to place, and they kept moving. The people kept following until finally they just realized it wasn't Catholic anymore. It was some kind of other church. So they left it. They went back to the Roman Catholic Church.
Well, it was Father Reynosa, right?
Yes.
But he was interested in breaking away from Rome, because he wanted the money that was collected to stay here, right?
Right.
But of course, in Mexico, the priests were also very persecuted. So they were
especially during the Cristero movement.
Exactly. So one can understand why he would come here and want to do that.
I think that's very important to tell people, because a lot of people don't know that. That's something that a lot of people have forgotten.
That's right.
And sometimes I forget, and I'll say, oh, my gosh, I forgot to mention Father Reynosa. And there was at that time, there was no such things as gangs. All the fellows of the colonia felt like there was a big family, and the people from like a fellow from West Dallas had better not come to court a young lady in Little Mexico, because the boys would chase him off.
Or vice versa. Which I did.
By the way, I don't know if a lot of you know that back when they called West Dallas, they called it Los Altos de Juarez, Juarez Heights, or just Los Altos, and that was it. But I don't know why they did that. I just remembered that. And as more and more people moved to Dallas, they started celebrating. But at that time, the Mexican people were not allowed in the Dallas parks. And so they would hold their celebrations in the streets. The Pastorela was one of them. I remember my father, he always used to participate in things like that. And my mother used to say that you took after your father. And it wasn't until 1931 that the people were allowed into Pike Park. Of course, there weren't that many parks in Dallas to begin with, but that Pike was the closest to Little Mexico. And then it became the place to hold the Cinco de Mayo celebrations and the 15th of September celebrations. At that time, there was a lot of discrimination. It was a black and white city. I remember in the department stores there would be the water fountains that would have for whites, for colored. And I'd go in there, I'd head for the white. Daring somebody to tell me something. There was a lot of discrimination against Mexicans too. If somebody got mad at somebody of Mexican descent, they would go, "Oh, you Mexican." They thought they were insulting us by calling us Mexicans. Even though we're born here, we love our country, but we love our parents' country too. And like I said, we spoke a lot of Spanish, so it's all in our hearts that we have to remember our parents' home too. And I had some school friends that somebody would ask him, "What are you?" And they would say, "I'm Spanish." Well, I heard them say that, and I say, "Why do you say that?" I said, "Don't be ashamed to say that your parents are Mexicans," because they thought, they were afraid to say they were Mexicans. I remember going to meeting my mother after school one day downtown. My mother had a restaurant, and I was going to Tech. I met her. We went to school. We went to downtown. And as we were passing through this place, I think you might remember where they sold orange juice.
Mm-hmm. On Elm and Early.
And I told my mother, "Let's go in and have a hot dog and some orange juice." And she said, No, mija. They don't serve Mexicans there. Oh, they don't? Come on. I dragged her in there, and I asked for hot dogs and orange juice, and they served us. And it wasn't until later that my mother found out I was allergic to orange juice.
But it was worth the sip, wasn't it, Catalina?
When I told her that, she says, "No wonder you always broke out every time I gave you orange juice when you were a little girl." So, by the 40s, Little Mexico was a thriving community, but in the late 50s and early 60s, plans were unveiled for the construction of the tollway. It carved a path right through the community, and eventually most of the residents started moving out to other parts of the city. But Pike remained in the hearts of many of the families of the colonia. On May 10th of 2000, the Dallas City Council voted unanimously to designate Pike Park as an official landmark of the city of Dallas, in honor of the Mexicans and Mexican-Americans who were born in Little Mexico and have contributed in a positive way to the growth of the city of Dallas. There are two other city landmarks in Little Mexico. They are the building that once housed St. Anne's School and Luna's Tortilla Factory that is still operating at 1615 McKinney. It started in 1924 on Caroline Street, and that was owned by a sister of my mother, Maria Luna. There are businesses that have remained faithful to Little Mexico, which include Villasana Grocery Store and Hernandez Finer Foods. They haven't forgotten New Mexico or their roots. Former residents and their descendants keep coming back to Pike because they remember a different time and a place in their lives. Some bring their grandchildren and show them where they grew up, where they played. There was a business section of Little Mexico on McKinney Avenue, where you would find restaurants, drugstore, shoe repair shop, curry shop, tortilla factory, and later on even a Mexican movie theater, Mr. Rodriguez. And a lot of people, I think, remember him. With television, computers, football games, nowadays sometimes I wonder if the children of today will have fond memories of their youth when they get to be older. I can still remember as a young girl how my brothers and I would get together with 5 or 6 others and roller skate around downtown, you know, and or we would walk up a sloping street when it rained. The water would be coming down, and we would walk in the water. I remember I always used to have my toes cut, because there would be some glasses in there. But we enjoyed that, going up the street. That was things to do. Or, you know, having a birthday party in the backyard with a piñata, breaking a piñata made by the mothers, you know. I can still remember waiting for Dora Villasana at Cochrane and St. Paul, and we would walk together all the way to Crozier Tech. We walked in those days. We didn't take buses or ride streetcars. We walked. We thought nothing of it. We would walk downtown on Sundays and go to the movies, go to eat. And, of course, everybody dressed up. In those days, everybody dressed up to go downtown. We wear hats and gloves and all that. I'm sure some of you remember. I don't know. I remember. I remember how the ladies that worked at my aunt's tortilla factory would take a tortilla that they had just made, the handmade, and they would put butter on it and some salt and roll it up, and then they would pinch the little corners and give it to me. And I was the little girl running around there, but I was their little pet. And so those are little things that I remember. Memories like these, I'm sure, are shared and treasured by those who were born in Little Mexico.
Thank you very much. That was quite a recollection that is not devoid of the struggles that people had living in Little Mexico. As Mrs. Valdez says, it was a very strong place to live, a very nurturing place, but there were a lot of struggles. As you notice in her talk, she mentioned education a lot. And I want to make sure that all of us remember that for our people, education has always been important. It is not strange at all to me that Mr. Martinez works with the school district. Mr. Martinez in our documentary talked very poignantly about his attending Travis Elementary School, and it was burned. It got burned down, and then he got to be placed in another elementary school where it was crowded. And Rene, I'm going to let you take over that story because your mother had a lot to do with a change that happened there.
Well, it's kind of a real good segue because Ms. Valdez was mentioning the Villasanas, and Dora was my cousin, and I'm a Villasana because my mother was a Villasana. So it's a good segue in the way she brought it up chronologically up to the 50s because I'm a product of the 50s. And it's rather ironic now. I've got a new title. I'm in charge of all parent involvement in the public schools. And the story that I tell and I speak to a lot of parents, mostly immigrant parents every day, is I use the story of my mother because many of our parents, or vast majority in Dallas schools, 65% are Hispanos or Latinos and of Mexican descent. 40% are limited English proficient, and they're immigrants. So I use the story of my mother, who Cata knew very well, was not fluent in English, in fact spoke very little English, had no education because she came to this country in 1916 and finally to Dallas in the 20s and went through all the discrimination that Ms. Scott mentioned. So she was a young girl and suffered a lot of discrimination, but it didn't stop her from having some real high expectations of my brother and I, for us to go to school, to be proud of who we were, and to go on to college. And this is back in the 40s and 50s. And so I give that story, I present that story to a lot of parents, that you don't necessarily have to be well educated. You don't have to be fluent in English, because my mother surrounded herself with what I call guardaespaldas, ladies like Ruth de Leon and Miss Morin, who were Mexican American, who were bilingual and very fluent, and Miss Muga, some very, very well-educated Mexican Americans, and that was her little circle. So when she began to get involved in the public schools, when they burned the school down and forced the hand of the administration through another institution that existed in Old Mexico, because I remember going to many of the meetings on Thursday nights of the Club Camellia. The Club Camellia was an auxiliary of the Dallas Garden Club. And these were ladies who were members of this little garden club, and they met at Little Mexico Projects. And they had the Mexican consulate's wife there, and that's where my mother developed her network and started articulating that the school had been burned. We were all going to Cumberland Hill, which was the second oldest school in the city. Travis had been the oldest. And we finally saw our principal full-time, because he had been a principal for 2 schools at the same time. We did not deserve a full-time principal. And his name was Alfred E. Lowe's, Lowe's Stadium. And the superintendent wouldn't want to meet with my mother because, as Ms. Scott said, they were just Mexicans. And because of her network with this little group, the Club Camellia, they set up a meeting with the president of the Dallas Garden Club. And the story goes on that the president of the Garden Club was Miss Woodall Rogers. And she was the wife of the mayor. And next thing you know, the Dallas Times Herald did a story, and the school got built a year later. But the story that I give to these parents is that you don't have to be educated. We want the kids to be educated, but you as mothers and fathers, and we're seeing a lot of parents that come to this country from Mexico with very little education, that all you have to do is be focused, have high expectations of your kids, get involved in the schools. There's a lot of things that you can do, not just the PTA, and that you can bring about change by asking tough questions and by being involved. And so that story rings very well in the eyes and ears of our parents right now. So I use that story a lot.
And no question about it. The way to propel yourself into doing what's right when you can't speak English is a very courageous thing, and that's what his mother represents. You also notice that Ms. Scott mentioned St. Anne's, and with us is former Councilwoman Valdez, who, with Ms. Scott, was very engaged in saving and trying to save St. Anne's School. This whole area that we now know as Uptown, or a good part of Uptown, was Little Mexico. And St. Anne's was a very important place for people there. Do you want to comment a little bit about St. Anne's and why that battle was so important?
Well, it is, and some of them were asking me the other day, was a plaque that was there, was it still there? And I said, yes, but I said, I'm not exactly sure where it is. And one of them mentioned that they go by there every day just to make sure that plaque is there. It drives by there every day.
It was a part of the, it was a Catholic girls' school, right?
Mm-hmm.
No, girls and
boys. Forgive me.
Girls and
Yeah,
boys.
forgive me. It was boys and girls, and there's a lot of very strong feelings about it. And developers, of course, were very eager to get a hold of that site. And you will see, when you drive by, you can still see portions of the building that, thanks to both of them, they were able to save, and there are some requirements there that developers must meet before they do anything. And you may know that they're going to be doing not only housing but some retail and galleries there too. So it will fit in well with what's going on in Uptown. But it is interesting to see that kind of high development came at the foundation of a very important community.
Yolette, can I add
Sure.
one thing also? I didn't grow up in the Catholic Church because of a lot of reasons in terms of my family being Catholic and then becoming Protestant. But the Protestant Church also had some tremendous roots in that community. There was a Presbyterian church on Carlisle, the First Mexican Baptist Church on Fairmount, the Methodist Emmanuel, which is still there on Harry Hines, a couple of assembleas. And now if you look at the statistics with evangelicals, and they've made an incredible inroads into the Hispanic community. So there were some linkages, linchpins of the Protestant church also in Little Mexico, right in the middle of Little Mexico, along with Our Lady of Guadalupe and the efforts of the priests. But there were some very dynamic Mexican-American ministers and pastors that were very involved in the community, and very little is known about them.
And that's an excellent point, and it underscores the fact that when we get represented in the media, and I'm part of the media, and so I say that with all of the best intentions, but there is room for criticism, as you know. We get represented as a monolithic population. And when in fact you can see when the communities started, there was great diversity. Diversity of religion, diversity of merchants, diversity of, all kinds of backgrounds. And so that just further underscores how truly diverse we are.
But yet at that time, with all these different religions, they all respected each other.
Exactly.
They even respected Father Reynoso's. And I was just thinking too that 20 years ago, you could stand in the gazebo at Pike Park and look at one side, and you could see all the buildings, everything. You could look the other way, you could see still some houses left. Now you don't see anything but big buildings going up.
And it was the tollway, as she said. It was the tollway that went right through the neighborhood that decimated it. And now we see what the rest of the tollway has brought. I wanted to talk about Pike Park because it is iconic. It's iconic in very many ways. It's iconic Tucata because of all of the fiestas patrias, all of the celebrations, the pride in being Mexican, which is so important to us. And it's also iconic in the sense that there was a flashpoint at Pikes Park, in terms of civil rights. And I want to talk to Rene Martinez about it because he himself was right there in the middle of the action. And it involved Santos Rodriguez. Santos Rodriguez was a young boy who got picked up in a squad car. Rene, you will have to refresh my memory. I can't even remember what he did, but it was something very innocuous.
He and his brother had broken into a Coke machine at a gas station off of Bookout in Cedar Springs. And they stole a couple of quarters. The policeman followed them to their grandfather's house near Harwood, went and saw the grandfather, got them out of bed. The grandfather did not speak any English, didn't really understand. He saw the police. He allowed them to go with the policeman. They went back to the scene there on Bookout. The street is no longer there because it kind of has been closed because of all the development. But it's right off Cedar Springs near the Crescent. They took him back to the scene of the crime, and one child was in the front seat, the other child was in the back seat, and they began to interrogate both brothers. They were both brothers. One was 13, the other was 12. And one of the officers, Officer Kane, pulled out his gun and began to play Russian roulette with Santos, and the gun went off and killed Santos. And immediately after that, a lot of community leaders, Reverend Rudy Sanchez, who was a pastor at First Mexican Baptist, and a lot of the Medrano family and others called a special meeting. Councilman Aguirre was involved. We had a meeting at Pikes Park, because really Pikes Park was the meeting place for a lot of events, not only the social events, but it was really the only place that we could use to have formal meetings or group meetings, because it would accommodate us. And that's where we kind of met the following day. In fact, I was working for Children's Television Workshop, part of Channel 13, and we went there and met, and that's where we planned the protest of the city council, and we planned the march that took place several weeks later.
But that march had some chaotic moments.
Well, I was there, and I was one of the folks up leading the march. There was really two marches. The first march was planned. It was on a Saturday. It was in July. It was hot. The first part of the march, then everybody met at Kennedy Plaza and marched towards the old City Hall steps down Main Street. It was very peaceful, and it was a very, very mixed crowd. A lot of families, kids in their strollers, African Americans, Anglos, majority Hispanic. And there was probably, the estimates were there was 3,000 to 5,000 people, because I could see from the steps of City Hall, you could still see all the people leaving from Kennedy. And then we had speeches at the steps, and several of us, Florentino Ramirez and myself and Peter Aguirre, Frank Hernandez, had met with the police and the city council prior. So we had a command station in City Hall. I was not in the command station. I was with the marchers. But we had a plan with the police to not have the tactical squad present, so that they wouldn't provoke the crowd, because folks were really upset. There was a lot of anger. And so the police were just, they didn't have a show of force. So the first march came, we had their speeches, and we got everybody to finish, and Councilman Aguirre was up there, and we all had different speakers, and then we told folks, go back, march back, and everybody very peacefully marched back down Main Street, down Neiman Marcus and all those nice stores. And all of a sudden, don't quite remember whether it was Ackerd or one of the side streets, another large crowd came. This was around 4:30 or 5. And this was a different subset of people. This were younger folks. Keep in mind it was Saturday. People had been drinking. There were young people, mostly Hispanics and African Americans, and they ran right into the marchers as they were leaving, and they said, no, let's go back. We need to hear the mayor, we need to hear the chief, we need to hear them come out and speak. And so the second march ensues. And by the time they got to City Hall, it was pretty rowdy. Folks had been drinking, and folks started throwing bottles. And a liquor store right on the corner of City Hall got broken into, and then really the riot ensued, and the crowd dispersed on Commerce and Main. The tactical squad took a beating. There was about 100 tactical squad right by the old library, and the chief of police ordered them not to attack the crowd. And I was at the point when, and I tell this story all the time, that the crowd was already rioting, and they had already jumped on top of a squad car, and I think it's in the papers. They literally flattened the squad car. Another person had blown a motorcycle policeman's motorcycle. And as they were dispersing and going down the streets and breaking into stores, I just kind of sat on the steps, and we were trying to talk people into stopping. It was no use. And I saw a very elderly Mexican-American woman after everybody had kind of left, and I was just sitting there, and she came up to the squad car with a newspaper wrapped around in her hand. And she was in her 70s, 80s, and came up to the squad car and started slamming the squad car with a newspaper. And when I looked at her, I said, I think it's time for me to go home. This lady is showing all the frustration and the anger and all the vented frustration that she had on that squad car. So it was very, very tense, very, very tense, very emotional. People say Dallas has never had a riot. That was a riot. It was a riot.
And, there's a lady to this day. She ran the recreation center on the corner of, not Wolf, the one just south of it, and Harwood. They had a small recreation center, and she ran that. And she claims to this date that Santos and his brother were there, and from there they went home. She said that they did not do it. So there's, with him getting killed, we'll never know.
And the tragedy is that the brother, I was doing translations at the jail about 6 years ago, and I saw his brother. He was being arrested. He'd been in the penitentiary. He was never the same. And he recognized me, and because I knew his mom, and it affected him the rest of his life. Been in the penitentiary.
No question about it. That was a changing point for this community. Rene Martinez is being modest because my colleague Bob Ray Sanders, who has great institutional memory, has told me many a time that Rene Martinez was one of the reasons why things eventually could calm down, that he was able to talk reason, even though, as he said, there wasn't a whole lot he could do, but he was one of the people who attempted to allay the crowd, to deal with the anger, anger that we have not seen since, except for, let's push over here to our times today.
Fast forward.
Fast forward. Because Pikes Park is in the shadow of the downtown area, and I don't have to tell you of the enormous rally that occurred this year on immigration. And what is the most fascinating thing about that, when you think about a young Santos Rodriguez getting shot and killed for stealing virtually nothing, and you look at what happened today when there are young kids in schools text messaging each other to say, we've got to do something about this. There is an injustice here regarding my family. You know, my family that came over to work, my family that came over to bring me here so I could get educated. And Rene, you work with these kids all the time. And this is just a terrific, it was a terrific revelation to all of us. I know I was sitting in the offices of KERA monitoring this because we had reporters out in the field. I was monitoring it on the internet, frankly. How else do you do things these days? And I just could not believe the swell of people. But it all got its start with students.
The students. Well, I tell folks that everything that I've learned to be trained to do kind of culminated with the kids walking out. And I happened to be at the right place at the right time because I was the person that was directed to go and be with the kids so that they would be safe and secure. So I was given the privilege of going out there. Unfortunately, the kids didn't go to Pikes Park. They went to Keys Park, which is the rallying point of Oak Cliff. And so we went out to Keys Park, and there was about 1,700 kids that came in from all the high schools in Oak Cliff. We got them organized to convince them to have their speeches and commended them, and we had police, helicopters. I was in charge of all the staff that was dealing with the kids. Got them on their buses to go home and got them all in and boarded. 30 minutes after they boarded, we heard that there was another 1,500 going to City Hall, to the new City Hall. So we had to jump on our cars and go there and do the same routine because the kids from the east, because as you all know, there's not one barrio now, there barrios are all over Dallas. So the kids from the east now were coming in, and the north, Hillcrest, W.T. White. We had kids that marched from Skyline all the way to City Hall. We had kids from Hillcrest that went to Thomas Jefferson, to Bachman Lake, then to City Hall. That's a long walk, okay? And so all the kids from the east and north came in. And we finally convinced them. I used as much of abilities that I have to coerce them, convince them to get on those buses and be safe and behave. And they did. The following day, which was even more eventful, 9 o'clock in the morning, and we're expecting, Dr. Hinojosa had said, we're not going to punish these kids. It's an unexcused absence, which was, I think, very, very smart, because other cities throughout the nation punished the kids. They suspended them. In Ennis, they didn't let them graduate. They didn't let them go to the prom. We didn't. We were one of the few cities in the nation that said, we have the sensitivity to what these kids are all about. But the following day, the middle school kids decided to walk out. And so we had middle school kids from Rusk, and this is really an interesting story. I met the kids from Rusk coming down Cedar Springs. They were marching to the administration building, and there was about 150 of them down Cedar Springs. A lot of traffic. We had squad cars and police with them, and they're on the street, and of course we're telling them be careful. And they get to Hall Street, where they're Little Mexico, where they're building all those beautiful townhomes and whatever. And we're telling them stay in line, be careful. all of a sudden, all the workers that are building these $1 million mansions come off the scaffolding, and they come to the curb. There's about 50 workers, of course, all Mexican. And they come up, and here's these kids marching, and the workers say, "Viva la juventud!" And the kids get scared. They thought they're yelling at them. And one kid says, "Hey, dummy, they're yelling at us. They're cheering us on." And that was very gratifying, because that was connecting with what the message the kids were doing with what, of course, Mexican immigrants were facing, and that's their parents. And so later we got them back in their buses, and then we had to go to City Hall again, because then the suburban kids got to City Hall. 1,000 kids from Irving caught the train, jumped the train, and 1,000 kids came in from Irving and Duncanville and Plano and Richardson. And there was about 3,000 the second day. And those were a little different, because those kids didn't know me. And we still had some kids from Dallas who ended up helping me as an adult convince those kids to get on the DART buses. We had to use DART buses. And we had no incidents. We had nobody arrested. So basically the kids were I think they were kind of the precursors to the mega march that took place a month later.
And I think all of this points to the fact that, in the context of this evening, that Little Mexico was the place where people felt at home, where people could congregate. And as the neighborhood disappeared and as more people have been coming into the city, of course our population is dispersed. When we look at elections, which we're about to face in a few weeks here, there is always an article or always a broadcast or two saying, well, what is the Latino vote going to be like? And time after time, it gets analyzed, and analyzed well. I'm not criticizing it at all. But there is always that anticipation, when is this enormous population going to be civically engaged and vote? And Rene just told you about these young people who are willing to walk out of school, to protest what they feel is an injustice. And we see time and time again that in the elections, there is a population that votes, but not with the anticipation that everybody is wanting or expecting or dreading, or whatever your perspective might be. But Rene has an interesting point about the groundwork that these kids have laid, if you want to share that with the audience.
I had the privilege to be in Mexico City about 2 weeks ago with a group of colleagues from a group called IME, Instituto Mexicanos Exterior, with the Mexican government. So there was colleagues of mine from all over the nation, who from LA, Chicago, who had the same experiences. And we heard a panel of scholars from University of California, Stanford, Notre Dame, who had done a recent study on immigration and reform and the marches and the walkouts. But part of the premise was that, one, there is a political awareness, but that the kids themselves, those 17 and 18-year-olds, they may not have the impact this November, but they definitely will have the impact 5 years from now. They definitely will have an impact 10 years from now, because you're talking about across the nation, thousands of young people that either were born here, they're going to become naturalized, they're very politically aware, and believe me, I spent a lot of time in the high schools, and those kids, they know what is going on. They just don't use MySpace. They know the issues, they know the candidates, they know what's bothering them in the community. They know what ought to change in the schools. So 5 to 10 years from now, that generation is going to have a tremendous impact electorally. We think, a lot of us think, on kind of the scenario of politics in this nation. A lot in Dallas, a lot in Texas, a lot in Southwest, and the other area is going to be what my colleagues from IME say, the emerging states. The emerging states are North Carolina, Kentucky, Arkansas, that have had 200 to 500% Hispanic increases in the past 5 years. You know, there's towns in Georgia that are now, 15 or 20% and 30% Hispanic overnight. And again, the population is very young. So the whole landscape, political landscape, is going to change dramatically over the next few years.
And I would like to leave some time for some questions, because I hope there's some, with all of the points that have been being raised this evening. But I wanted to go back to Little Mexico, because it is so changed. But everyone that I talk to, whether it's you or people that we found in our documentary or people that I meet, Little Mexico will never vanish. It has vanished physically, but it will never vanish in the hearts and the minds of the people who grew up there. And it wasn't the only conclave. I mean, there was Cement City. There was another place where Mexican immigrants lived. But you never hear anything about Cement City, because there was not, from what I can tell, not the life, not the pulse, not the vibrancy that Little Mexico had. And tell us why that is.
Well, Pikes Park socially, I was one of those kids that put on my charro outfit. My mother forced me to put on a charro outfit to go dance with another little 5-year-old during the Cinco de Mayo. So I remember that vividly. The other thing that Pikes Park did for us was athletics. I learned how to play baseball. I learned how to play basketball. I learned how to play soccer there. The Duron family, who is an old family also in Old Mexico, the older Marciano Duron was my coach. So a lot of us really were exposed, and this is a story that hasn't been told, because there was a lot of great athletes that went on to Crozier Tech that never went to college. And these were athletes like Henry Pantoja and others who were tremendous athletes that were produced by those leagues that we had there at Pikes Park, by the coaches like the Durons and others who coached us in baseball. And that story's never been told. To this date, I was an athlete in North Dallas, and I've been a coach, and I've been very much an enthusiast of athletics, but it started at Pikes Park with those coaches that would spend the time with kids, because there was nowhere else to go. We couldn't go to River Sean. We couldn't, I didn't learn how to swim in Pikes Park, unfortunately, because it wasn't deep enough. I learned how to swim in Turtle Creek. We could swim in Turtle Creek in those days. You stayed away from the snapping turtles. But Pike Park had a great impact socially and also extracurricular-wise on a lot of kids, a lot of families. Hundreds of us. Every time I also went to Cumberland Hill. When we have Cumberland Hill gatherings and reunions, we talk about those stories. We talk about our teachers at Cumberland Hill and at Travis. We talk about the events that we had at Pikes Park.
I remember he said about costumes. My mother always had me in costumes, china poblana and all that, since I was a little girl. Then she started putting up a enchilada stand, which some people to this day still remember, because she used to cook the enchiladas on a big grill, and it had a burner. And she rented 3 spaces, one to cook and one to serve the people. And before she even started cooking, the tables were full. And she'd be over there trying to get the thing going with the charcoal. And I'd be running around with china poblanas or whatever costumes, everything. Then when I grew up older, then I helped her, and I was a cashier. And then in 1965, the Federation of Mexican Organizations asked me to join. And as soon as I joined, they put me in charge of the festivity committee. And to this day, now I'm hoping my daughter takes over. She has a very good committee that want to continue with that tradition that the Federation started. They don't want that feeling to go away. There are lots of fiestas celebrating the 15th of September and all that, but mostly commercials. And this one that was started at Pike Park was, the one that it's supposed to be the one. And when I grew up old enough, I didn't wear any more costumes because mother helped me. I was helping her. I was a cashier while she was over here cooking. I was a cashier. But I used to see the older men that had started the Federation of Mexican Organizations in 1937. And there was only about 3 or 4 left. And I would see them going across, to fix the stage, to set the stage and the benches and all that. And they used to say, ahí van los viejitos de la Federación. There go the little old men from the Federation. And then in 1965, they asked me to join. And there was another young fellow that joined at the same time that I did. And we worked very well together. And I used to tell him, I said, do you remember how they used to call them? There goes the little old people from the Federation. I said, you and I are going to grow old, and they're going to say they're going to little old people from the Federation. But unfortunately, he had a heart attack right there in front of Pike Park at the end of we used to have a Independence Day parade. And he had a heart attack right there in front. And they wouldn't tell me that who he was until somebody just came over and opened their mouth and said, Mariano is dead. And I don't know what happened. But next thing I knew, Mercedes had brought the car inside the park, and they put me in the car and drove me home. I must have fainted or something, I don't know. But I was on the Landmark Commission when Pike Park was made historic landmark. Also, when Luna's Tortilla Factory. But when Pike came up, and I knew all the building that was going around and everything. So there was another fellow, I can't remember his name, but we decided we'd better hustle and get Pike Park. Made an official landmark. Otherwise, they're going to sell it, and Pike Park's going to be gone.
Sure.
And so now I've been thinking that I think we should investigate to see what part of, if it was the whole park made of historical or just the building. The whole park, good.
Yeah.
That was going to be a question that I was going to be bringing up, because we surely don't want that to disappear.
The other thing that Little Mexico had, Cata mentioned the stores, and two of them are still there, Villasana and Hernandez. But the first funeral home, Cortez Funeral Home, which is now Gonzalez, was there on Harwood, right down the street from Channel 13. And the other element was restaurants. The first Mexican restaurants were in Little Mexico. El Phoenix, of course, was one of the first, but there was also a very famous restaurant that my dad used to work with called El Acapulco, which is right across the street from El Phoenix.
But that one came later,
Yeah.
after my mother's.
But the point is that there was some very fine, Tasco later on McKinney.
Yes.
There was 5 or 6 very fine restaurants in Little Mexico. Now, of course, we've got hundreds, but that's where they started. The very fine Mexican food restaurants came from Little Mexico.
The important thing, too, that I think about, at that time, you had the owners of the restaurants or businesses. There was no CEOs at the time. You'd go into the restaurant, you'd see the owner serving people or making food. My mother made all the food in her restaurant. And you'd go to El Phoenix, and of course, Mike Martinez, the founder of El Phoenix. A lot of people, their customers would walk in, and they'd see these old men, sweeping out in front. They never knew he was the owner. And we didn't call him Mike. We called him Mikey. Mikey, Mr. Mikey, So, there's a lot of things, people that I remember more than you, because I came way before you.
A little bit. My father was a waiter, both at El Phoenix and Acapulco.
Mm-hmm.
And he had 2 very, very good customers. And he always bragged that his older son was going to be a doctor, which my brother is a doctor, went on to Austin College and medical school here in Dallas. But one of his customers they loved my father. My father's name was Servando. And his name was Mr. Mudge.
Mudge.
Mr. Mudge donated millions of dollars to SMU. And his other customer was Charles C., which was a benefactor in this community. Well, both of those men, when my brother graduated from Austin College, first of all, Mr. C. gave my brother a scholarship to go to Austin College because we were Presbyterian. And then Mr. Mudge helped my brother, who lived in Little Mexico projects, when he went to medical school. Because again, he loved my father. That was his waiter. And in his way to help us, he gave my brother a scholarship money to go to medical school. But again, that came from working there at the Acapulco and at the El Phoenix in Little Mexico.
As you can see, extraordinary amounts of pride about this very significant neighborhood. So I'd like to leave it open for questions. And there's Dr. Linden. I knew he would have one.
Well, Rene Martinez has done more than he's talked about. But I remember I worked with him in the early 70s putting together the desegregation book, and he convinced, I think, Mac Taylor to include Hispanics as the third group. Because the black-white is what it was most of the time. And then I think, you want to talk about that, Mac Taylor decided that Hispanics deserved to be recognized as third group. Remember how difficult that was to do? Can you talk about that? Because then we pushed the whole desegregation to Hispanic students are getting fair treatment all the way through the quotas and all this stuff, which is remarkable for 30 years, because now they're part of the story, not just black and white, but the Hispanic.
Well, we were the first city in the country, other than Denver, that was going through desegregation, the Keys case, that, again, Judge Taylor, who was appointed judge by I think it was John Kennedy, appointed a federal judge, had the foresight to appoint 3 of us, not just an African American and a white, but an Hispanic. I later found out why, because I never knew why he had appointed me. I was 24 years old and long hair, and it turns out that I was working with the Dallas Community Relations Commission, and the chairman was Tom Eunice. Tom Eunice was a very, very prominent lawyer in Dallas who worked with Strasburger and Price. Well, it turns out that Judge Taylor had been a member of Strasburger and Price before he became a judge, and they knew each other, and so he asked to recommend a Mexican American. Tom Eunice thought I was good, and I ended up being on the committee. But the rest was history. We articulated the fact that there should be, that we were not white, as Gata says, we were not counted as white, because the busing would have been between African Americans, and if we had been counted as white, with Hispanics. On that committee, I also had to make some unpopular recommendations, and one was the closing of Crozier Tech, which was at that time, Crozier Tech, in the 50s and 40s and 30s had been the school, very prominent school, had won state championships in basketball and football. When Madison closed down, all the Madison kids came, who were white, came to Crozier Tech, and they had an incredible football team. But in the 60s, the school really began to diminish in terms of quality. It became the Mexican school, and it was a technical school. So it was drawing from all over the city. And it was the dumping ground for the DISD for old teachers that were just going to retire, and principals that were just didn't really care. So they had shops and metal shop and wood shop, and very few of our kids were going on to college. So at that time, Nolan Estes had just opened up a brand new school, and it was called Skyline, 1968, 69. And Skyline was about 80% white when it opened up. And so in 1971, Judge Taylor said, I'm going to devise a plan. What do you all recommend? And I recommended that they close Crozier Tech down. And I had a series of meetings in the community, in Pikes Park and in other areas, and I took a beating. People saying, that's tradition. Crozier Tech is tradition. And I said, yes, tradition, but it's not sending your kids to college. And so Pauline Medrano reminds me that she was ended up being a cheerleader at Skyline, but she had to go to Skyline. She was going to Crozier Tech, and later ended up being a cheerleader at Skyline, because they allowed everybody that had been in a certain status at Tech that could do the same thing at Skyline. So she later became a cheerleader drill team at Skyline. So that we bussed literally all the Mexican American kids from West Dallas and La Bajada, Los Altos. Some went to Skyline. All the ones in Little Mexico went to Skyline. And then the other kids from Ledbetter went to Pinkston. But that's how we integrated really Skyline. And then we sent all the black kids in 71 that were going from South Dallas, some from East Dallas to Skyline. So those were the, if we hadn't done that, if Judge Taylor had not recognized us, it would have been just blacks busing to schools with Hispanics and Hispanics with blacks, and the Anglos would not have been affected.
Hispanics became a critical thing by the 90s, and when the question on the school board, blacks, whites, and Hispanics, a number of Trini and others were involved in this. So we ended up with a desegregation plan, which didn't come in 94, 95, came 10 years later.
Right.
But Hispanics shifted really from the essentially from working with blacks to working with whites because they knew there was a need. And the need resulted in a much better situation than otherwise.
Well, as you well know, Glenn, if you look at Dallas, and Glenn says this in his book very well, is, from the Brown decision in 54 to the time, and that was when I was at Cumberland and Travis when the school burned down, and if you look at that from 54 to the time I graduated from North Dallas in 1965, and Dallas had what was called a stair-step plan, that they integrated grade by grade, year by year, after 54, 55. So by 1964, 65, I graduated from North Dallas. I had never been to school with an African-American student. I went to SMU, and lo and behold, Jerry Levias, the first African-American, that was the first African-American I went to school with. And North Dallas had its first African-American kids coming in 65. So it took literally 9 years to integrate all the grade levels. It doesn't mean to really integrate it. And, of course, it took another 6 years after that to really integrate the schools. But that was the way Dallas did things in those days.
Yes.
Yolette, I just wanted to mention, we would love to record our audience questions, so if you have a question, if you just go to the line, please, so that way we can make sure it's on tape.
Well, let me repeat what Dr. Linden said just for the record, so he doesn't have to get up from his chair. Dr. Linden wanted to recognize Rene Martinez for his acumen and his contributions in being on the tri-ethnic committee that Judge Mac Taylor created in order to deal with the desegregation of the schools. And you heard Mr. Martinez's answer about how, for the first time, Hispanic children were counted. Any other questions? Yes?
Let me say thank you to all three of you for doing this evening. Earlier you talked a little bit about the tollway and the tollway coming through Little Mexico. Can you talk about the process in the community? I mean, today we would obviously have to have community meetings and all this discussion, and I know that didn't occur, but kind of what was the process when the tollway started to come through and the decisions were made? How did you find out about it? What kind of discussions occurred in the community?
Well, one thing, they started buying their houses and they started moving away. They're really, they didn't think at the time, that they could do anything about it. So they just, they said, we're going to buy your home. So they sold it. And of course they got good money for it, and they bought better homes. That's how the community all of a sudden was not there anymore.
Was there any eminent domain? Did any eminent domain occur?
Yeah, there was some. There was no organized plan, Meletta. I mean, having been vice president of the planning commission, there was no planned process by the city. There was no community hearings. Gus Calderon, who lived right there off of Harwood, I remember, and Frank Hernandez was very outspoken. Those were two of our leaders that were very outspoken, that went into the community and said, look, you don't have to be selling. You can wait it out. You can get more money. And we lived on Cedar Springs. We lived on the other side of Cedar Springs and Cole. So we weren't that affected. But what I remember was that Frank and Gus organized the community, and they had meetings. They had meetings at Pikes Park where they were telling folks, you don't have to sell. There is eminent domain. But, there was no bilingual newsletters. There was no bilingual flyers. There was no public hearings to come and talk to the community in both languages. There was none of that. It was just a few articulate organizers like Frank and Mr. Calderon and his family, Pancho Medrano, who really, they knew the community, and they went to those families and said, you've got to get, the right amount of money for your homes. And then Frank, I think, represented a group of folks, and they sued the city. And so they kind of slowed the process a bit. But by that time, as Cata said, a lot of people had already sold.
And a lot of them are still there, though.
Yeah.
As you go down McKenna towards Harry Heights or the tollway, I don't know if you all remember the story about this man that did
First Bank?
that lived right on, yes,
Right
right on the
around-
corner
across-
of Wolf and
Frost.
he would not sell, and so the benches built around him.
They built
And
around, yeah.
I saw his son, Sonny, not too long ago. I said, "What happened to your father?" And it turns out he told me that his father had died, but he didn't sell. And there's still some.
They're still there. Yeah.
There's still some.
And
there,
believe me,
you know.
Frost Bag, Jim Johnston wants that property, but, you know, he's
And he
not
wouldn't
selling.
sell. He
Yeah.
wouldn't sell. And I happened to pass by one day. I was coming home from a landmark commission. I was going home, and at that time there was a lot of focus on that. And I stopped at the red light, and I saw some cameramen there. I said, "Oh, there must be." It was national news, and they were interviewing him there. And then Sonny told his father, "Hey, there's Cata." And I had rolled down my window, and so he's recognized, "There's Cata." He said, and then the light turned green, and I had to move, and don't go, come back. And then later on, it was the national news. They made the national news.
There were some other beautiful parts of the community, because I think Yolette said Little Mexico was not just Harry Hines and the projects. Little Mexico, I drove Phil Ritter from TI all over the neighborhood the other day, and if you drive into what is called the Uptown, I don't know what that is, Uptown, but if you drive up Cole Avenue like towards Travis, there's still some homes there that are what they used to be originally. But all up and down Cole, all up and down Ruth, those were all homes, Victorian-style homes. Beautiful homes, and a few of them are still there. But the majority of those were owned by Mexican Americans. So you're looking at several hundred families that lived on this side of the toll road that most people think, well, was that Little? Yeah, it was Little Mexico, but it was the other part of Little Mexico.
It's a Swiss.
Well, no, it wasn't necessarily wealth. It was most of those families, though, owned their homes. Some leased, some rented. The home where my mother, where we lived, we had a 2-story Victorian-style house, and I tell the story that she rented all the rooms upstairs. It was the first stop for immigrants, and I can go to any the Petroleum Club, whatever restaurants around here, and all the waiters know my father, because she used to rent the rooms upstairs as folks would get here from Mexico. And then my father would get them jobs in the restaurants or the hotels. And so some of the older guys are still in those places. And so all the rooms upstairs, it was a 24-room house, and all the rooms upstairs were apartments. And she only rented to males. She would not have any females there, because, she did not want to have any hanky-panky with the men. And so my mother was very traditional.
When Rene said that, it reminded me of, I think some of you remember when, before there was there used to be just the liquor private clubs. You couldn't buy them over the counter. And I used to be able to, we'd have a bunch go out for the evening, and let's go to this club, or let's go to this club, and we'd go, Cata, how can you get into all these clubs? I either knew a waiter or a cook or something, and that's how I got into those.
Any other questions? Any comments?
But Little Mexico was the stopping point for folks who were coming from Mexico. That's where they came. They weren't going to West Dallas first. They weren't going to of course, East Dallas was not Hispanic. They would come to Little Mexico. And there was boarding houses. Miss Valdez, Filimon Valdez's mom, who lived right down the street from, she had also a big house. She rented rooms. So there was like 5 or 6 big boarding houses. And that's where the immigrants from Mexico would come in and stay, get a job, and then move out. And their families would come, and then they would transition.
And nowadays, they say about Hispanic people, and I say Mexican American people, because really it was a Mexican people that, built whatever there was that the Mexican, that Hispanic. Nowadays, you say Hispanic, but it was really the Mexican American that did everything in the city. The others came later.
She is being politically correct.
Yeah. No, and it's true, and I think to this day that's true too, because most of the immigrant population is Mexican, some Central American.
It's about 70%.
Yeah. So it's still true today.
And I would say that maybe 98% of them came here legally. You know, there wasn't anything as illegal immigrants in it. They all came after the Revolution War, but yet they came legally. They found out how they could come up here and work, and they did legally.
Well, I'll pass that along to Senator Hutchison tomorrow because I'll be moderating a debate
Oh,
with her
good.
and her opponent.
Good.
So we will talk about immigration there tomorrow night as well in another way. But thank you so much for your... Oh, you had a question. Go ahead.
Well, I came a little late, so I'm not sure if you addressed this, but since St. Thomas is so close, and it's one of the early African-American communities that budded old Little Mexico, what kind of rapport or interaction or shared celebrations or of any kind might have happened?
That was a line of demarcation.
Yes.
McKinney Avenue was a line of demarcation between the African-American neighborhood and the Hispanic neighborhood. I'll tell another story. I went to Spence Middle School, and we were coming back. There's a group of us that lived in Little Mexico projects, and then those of us that lived in the uptown area. And we walked from Spence, which is over there off of Capitol, all the way to Little Mexico. We'd play sports, we'd play football, so we'd walk. And that's a good jaunt from Haskell all the way down. And there was always about 8 guys, and we'd always, be horse playing and messing around, and we'd stop at a little Dairy Queen on Haskell. And so one day we decided to take a shortcut, and we decided to cut across through Hall Street by the cemetery. Well, we were going to cut through the African American. This is in 1959, 1960. We were all 8th graders, 9th graders. We decided to do a little shortcut. And this is right through the middle of the African American neighborhood. And remember, it was segregated. We didn't go to school together. We knew that there were African Americans over there. They didn't live in our neighborhood. There wasn't any tension, and it was just there. And so we were walking down Hall Street. There's about 8 of us, and we see African American kids coming from Oak Grove. And then we turned around, and we're 12, 13 years old, turned around to go back towards Central, and there was another group of African American kids coming this way. They had seen us. So we were pretty scared. So we decided to run, but we didn't have anywhere to run. So we decided to jump the fence into the cemetery. And this is about 7 o'clock at night. So we jumped into the cemetery. All of us jumped the fence, and the African American kids were chasing us. And we started running, and I remember vividly, I fell, and it was I guess they had just buried someone, and the grave was open. I fell. It was dark, and saw the kids running by me, and I was breathing hard, and I was dirty. The next thing I know, somebody puts his hand next to my shoulder, and of course I'm scared to death, and it was one of my friends. And we crawled literally from the middle of the cemetery all the way to McKinney Avenue, where Travis is, crawled on the ground. But that was kind of the adventure. You didn't cross into their neighborhood. You didn't go into Thomas. Maybe, later on when I was in college, but not in those years. It was just a line of demarcation.
I was telling Yolette a story about, how it was divided black and white. And there was this barbecue place about a block and a half from Little Mexico.
The barbecue place?
Barbecue place.
That was on Hall and Thomas?
No. This one over here by Phil and close to McKinney.
Oh, okay.
And it was called the Beaumont. And they did not serve whites. And they had good barbecue. And I remember my aunt, everybody knew her because they went to her tortilla factory. And she could go. They would serve her, but in the kitchen. She had to eat in the kitchen. So they had their little rules too.
But answer your question, very little interaction.
All right. Well, thank you.
I just want to say how grateful all of us are for your participation in sharing all these personal stories. I, for one, as a relative newcomer to Dallas, have opened up a new window into the history here. I don't think I'll ever be able to go by Harry Hines again or past Little Mexico and not think of what rich history and life was there.